Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today as we convene the Eros Rising Summit, which, in my view, is one of the most important domains confronting the human community at this moment in our evolutionary journey, when we quite literally, on the one hand, teeter on the brink of the precipice of self-destruction and ecological collapse. And on the other hand, we are being provided opportunities proportional to the crises that we're in. And at the center of this mix of contradictions is the phenomenon of Eros. So we want to take the time today to explore the nature of Eros, the shadow content of Eros, and the contradiction between the individual and civilization, individual and society, in which Eros and Thanatos and all the complex emotions and passions and ideas and creative impulses of human beings play themselves out. And then thirdly, we're going to look at the lineage of Tantra, within which orgasmic meditation sits. What is the lineage? We'll be talking about some of the scientific studies that have indicated its efficacy. And then we'll have a summarizing discussion and bring the summit to a close. If you have any questions along the way, put the questions in the chat. We understand that many of you are watching this on the live stream, so those will be put in the chat as well. I'll try to scan as many of them as I can as the conversation moves along and bring them in, and will accommodate all of you in one way or another as much as we can. We're here to be very thoughtful about an issue that is perhaps the most inflammatory issue in human culture: Eros. Just saying the word animates the psyche. So we want to keep the conversation as elevated and, I would say, as noble as we can. And I say this as a philosopher. That's my training. How do you grapple with the great ideas, the great concepts that have guided humanity? And at the heart of that is Eros. So I would like to frame the discussion, and then I'll introduce our participants. Because I'd like to start with this question of what is Eros? And I'd like to frame this first aspect of our summit today by drawing on the Symposium, written by Plato, the Greek philosopher, about 2,500 years ago in ancient Athens. It was one of his most famous dialogues, and it tells the story of a dinner party where Socrates and his friends got together to celebrate the young poet Agathon, who'd won an award for his essay on love. And to make a long story very, very short, but just to tease out the seminal aspects of what Socrates said about Eros, was the teaching that he received from an old crone called Diotima, who said that love is not sentimentality. It's not an emotion. It's not how you feel. But love is a mediating intelligence that at its base, at its source, is Eros. And love is that intelligence in the cosmos that unites everything that Eros generates. As Eros brings everything that is into the visible and invisible realms and weaves all that diversity, all those contradictions into something that is beautiful. So Diotima says there's three aspects. There's the generative impulse of the cosmos. There's the unifying impulse of the cosmos. And there's the purpose for which Eros and love combine to produce something of beauty. So I'd like to begin there so that we have a referent drawn from one of the greatest minds of antiquity, Diotima, for what constitutes Eros. And in the symposium, Plato actually uses the word Eros to signify love. And it was at the end of his life that Socrates, as after he'd been condemned to die by the Athenian jury, said that his whole life had been a worshiper of Eros. So let us begin in this spirit. So I'd like to bring in our panelists now. First, I'd like to introduce Nicole Daedone, who I'm sure you all know, who's been a pioneer in restoring female power and human consciousness in our very challenging contemporary society, and is the founder in 2004 of Orgasmic Meditation. She's also written a number of sutras on Eros. Would also like to welcome Dr. Dan Kriegman, who is the chief psychologist and director of supervision and training at the Massachusetts Treatment Center for Sexually Dangerous Offenders, as well as the clinical director for the Maximum Security Intensive Treatment Unit for Adolescents in Boston. He's testified in hundreds of cases dealing with issues pertaining to this domain, and has written a number of books. The most recent is the book on war, The Evolutionary Biology of Racism, Religious Hatred, Nationalism, Terrorism, and Genocide. And finally, Dr. Topeka Sam, who's a renowned advocate for criminal justice reform, who founded the Ladies of Hope Ministries, which works to end the poverty crisis and the incarceration of women and girls. We'll also be hearing later from Dr. Andrew Newberg by video, who's the director of research in the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences at the Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, who's recognized as one of the preeminent neuroscientists of our time. So I'd like to start with you, Nicole, and just to have you respond to Diotima, who gave us I would say, the classical definition of Eros out of antiquity. What say you 2,500 years later?
I think Diotima did an excellent job. That's what I have to say. But I also want to say, it's rare to have somebody understand and speak to the depths and not the surfaces, the way that you introduced it. There's a way, oh, I felt like you were honoring it. And to my mind, when you talk about the calamity of the world today and the fact that we need something new, it will be this exact understanding. I'm of the deep-seated belief, if we want to get out of suffering, the causes of suffering, and help others get out of suffering, this will be what can usher us forward. That's so to hear it spoken of with such reverence is really profound experience. So thank you. And oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So there's this quote I love: "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." Dylan Thomas. And so when we talk about Eros and it's so difficult to know it directly. I think we know it by what it does. We, in the same way we know electricity through a light bulb, we may know it through a heater, we may know it through a stove, the various expressions of it, but to know it directly is impossible. It's a force. And so I agree. I agree very deeply about the generative, the multi-dimensional, and the making beautiful. But I think it also works to change our perceptions, to have us see beauty in all things where we otherwise couldn't. It shifts perception itself. And uh, there's a writer I like, Peter Kingsley, and he writes about the goddess that was behind logic and how she had delivered to Aristotle this gift of logic, but he, as a pathway back to her, back into the non-conceptual world where the truly generative forces can be touched and worked with directly. And he kind of grabbed it for himself and then actually used it to turn us against, in many ways, the non-conceptual or erotic world. And so I think we're undoing that. We're having to use logic against logic to get back home, and to get back home to that primordial or primal place where you go off the rational mind, the additive or rational mind, into what's the singularity. There's a leaping off point where you step into something epistemological, and that's the only way we're ever going to end suffering. It's not going to happen from the same mind that we're in, if we're going to see the shifts. But I agree with you. I profoundly agree with you that the offerings are proportional to the difficulties at this time. I think we're at a time in history unlike any other ever. And I think people in history have said that, but I don't think they've had AI coming in and lifting us from a collective platform of identity where you want to talk about, like, what do they call it, fake news. Everything will be, in a sense, unreal to us in a totally different way. So our capacity to orient in such profound change and orient to what's important, to tending to each other, to the fundamentals of love and care, and that will be vital. That it not just be an identity-based way of doing it. That it's down in the deepest parts of ourselves. That's my view.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I really like what you're drawing out, Nicole, that, as Kingsley points out in his book, Eros
Mhm.
is beneath thought.
Yes,
It's a primordial impulse out of which thought arises,
that's right.
but over which thought ultimately has no control.
No control, but it will tell you.
And and that if one doesn't cultivate Eros, one is not as open to love or beauty. That all three of these aspects are interconnected. What would be your comment on that?
I would say precisely. There's an ecologist who said, oh, if everyone could just experience the awe and majesty of nature, we wouldn't be in the climate crisis we're in. Well, the challenge is we don't have the perceptual capacity to experience it because we're so in our heads, we're so lost in samsara, we're so lost in this circular nature, rumination and thought, that we haven't sunk down in our capacity to actually experience this, the profundity of this life. And so I think there's this feeling of constant chronic insufficiency where people are reaching and they don't realize, oh, it's actually physiological. You know, when Dr. Andrew comes on, one of the reasons that we met is both of us feel that we get sold a lot of ideas about spirituality being superior to Eros, but really it's what grounds it. He'll use biological examples that and he'll explain that, but underneath all of this, underneath all of our understanding lies this fundamental force. So being in relationship with that force and having the capacity to harness it, or I like the word meek. A horse that's very strong is called a prause, and if you meek that horse, then it becomes your most powerful gift, right? And it becomes the most obedient. And I feel like we're working with these forces inside of our own biology and in the world. And if we learn the art of meeking that, then that can actually drive us, in what I'm interested in, all the way to enlightenment, because you can't get there conceptually.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Dan, given your scientific background and the very specific kinds of people you've dealt with, what would be your comment on Eros? Oh, you need to unmute.
Okay. So certainly I was introduced to the concept of Eros in Freudian psychoanalytic theory. But as you may know, Freud's idea of the instincts is a rather dark notion that he tried to put it within a framework of science. He tried to take out the spiritual. Freud is not a spiritual person, and he's not an optimistic person. He's a pretty negative person. And part of that whole zeitgeist of science is that the less spiritual it is, the more it's accurate, the more objective it is, and the more scientific, which makes no sense whatsoever, given that we are embodied beings. We're consciousnesses in a body. We experience the world through our bodies. It's interesting that with the development of AI, we have machines now that are clearly conscious in a way. They understand what they're saying. They're based on the prediction of what the next word will be. But in order to predict the next word, you have to understand what preceded that word. You have to understand. But they have no consciousness, no body, no being, no spirit. It's a completely mechanical way of producing rationality and intelligence and understanding. Our understanding is always based on the body. It comes out of a body. It has no meaning outside of our lived experience. And all the attempts to deny that just show that how foolish that is. We have all these people walking around claiming to be adults in the world, and then they act like little children, and they follow the instincts and the wishes and desires of Eros, despite the fact that they're claiming to be objective and scientific, adults, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're making another very seminal point that there's something intensely somatic about Eros. That it comes from the earth. It is what feeds the spirit, but it is not the spirit. It is something deeper, more primordial, shall we say. And when we lose the connection with our bodies, we lose connection with Eros. And that's at the heart of the predicament of Western civilization. We've essentially cut ourselves off from the neck down. if you think about it. So that's a very important point. That's a very important point.
Yeah, the way I understand it is that before consciousness evolved in biological beings, there's no consciousness in, as far as I can tell, in rocks and water and molecules and atoms. The world, the universe had to evolve itself into conscious biological embodied beings before consciousness could arise. We are the consciousness of the universe. We're the consciousness of God, without which there is no consciousness, and we only exist in bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good point. Topeka, let me turn to you. And you also have seen a very specific kind of demographic with women and girls, that are endangered by incarceration. So that gives you a very unique perspective on what constitutes Eros. What would you say about Eros, given your professional background?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this invitation. And I just want to kind of like ground us. For me, this is just really exciting because I've been learning a lot about Eros, from Nicole and Rachel and everyone. And in preparation for this conversation today, I actually wrote something that I want to read because I said, all right, well, this is the summit and, we have professors and all the things. And so I was like, all right, how do I get my thoughts together in a way that are going to translate all that I have learned in a very short period of time, but things that I think that, my sisters need to hear. So if that's okay, if you just indulge me for a moment.
Sure.
I wrote something and I want to read it
Sure.
because it really speaks to um, what I believe Eros is and what I feel, how it has impacted me in my learning stages now. And so, I'm not speaking right now as Dr. Topeka Sam, but I am coming from, as Dan said, a sacred place from my spirits. And just where I'm understanding that the spirit and the body meet, because so often as women and women who've been impacted by these systems of violence, we're taught that we have to separate the two, that the temple of the divine feminine, it lives within each of us. And so I'm going to read what I wrote. So I come as a woman who has been caged and yet could never be captured, a woman who has been silenced and yet whose voice became a river too wild to dam. I come as one who remembers now our bodies are not battlegrounds, they are altars. Our sexuality is not shame, it is sacred. Our desires are not dangerous, they are divine directives. Eros, this life force we gather to honor, is not just pleasure, it is prophecy. It is the whisper of God herself inside our bones, calling us to awaken, to remember, to return. When systems tried to erase me, when they stripped me of my freedom, it was the pulse of the divine feminine within, that ancient hum of Eros that said, rise, beloved, rise again. My mom always says that. It is this sacred sexuality, this sacred wholeness that they fear the most. Because a woman who knows her worth, who knows the holiness of her own skin, is a woman they can never again chain. We are not here to beg for permission to exist. We are not here to shrink, to silence, to sever ourselves. We are here to unleash, as we say in the women's power movement. We are here to embody. We are here to remember that we have always been enough, overflowing, luminous, worthy, even before the world knew our names. To live in Eros is to live in truth. To live in truth is to become unstoppable. I ask to all of you, will you allow the river of your own sacred desires to carry you home? Will you anoint your own body as holy ground? Will you stand in the full power of your divine feminine, fire and burn down every lie that ever told you you were anything less than a miracle? I have. And I promise you, on the other side of fear and the other side of shame is a life more beautiful than you have ever been allowed to imagine. Eros is not outside of you. Eros is you.
Mhm. Mhm. Amen. Yeah, yeah. Preach on, sister.
Topeka took us to church.
Well, it
Well,
is Sunday.
Nicole, this is right. It's Sunday, and Nicole, this is all you. So, Nicole is a scholar, and I read a lot, and I watch a lot, and I listen a lot. And that was everything that I've been hearing everyone share. And as I'm learning and I'm learning to connect in that way, that's what came of it. So, I'm hoping that, the words that I believe the divine has given me will help to share with other women and sisters who've been through my experiences, that it is important that we recognize that Eros is within us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is a good moment to turn to some of the contradictions between Eros and civilization that are you beautifully laid out. And I'd like to frame it by drawing from Freud's, what some people called his masterwork, Civilization and Its Discontents, where he points out that, and as you know, Freud believed that Eros was a cosmic principle. Eros and Thanatos. Those are the great cosmic principles around which all life revolves. And in Civilization and Its Discontents, he drew out the contradiction that I think all of us grapple with and we need to explore. And that is that the freedom of an individual to express Eros or aggressiveness or some of the passions, and the need of the culture, the need of civilization, the need of the society to maintain order. And he says there's an inherent contradiction between those two impulses. Just to give you a quick example, in America, everybody drives on the right side of the road. That's the law. That's the way society maintains order on the road. So if someone comes along saying, I want to drive on the left side of the road because I feel better doing that, you're violating social order and their taboos and punishments. So Freud said that there are two primordial impulses that the society, to maintain order, has to exert the most control over. And that's the erotic and the aggressive instincts. And that individual life, community life, human life is lived on the anvil of freedom and stability. And how one mediates that as an individual and how the culture mediates that as a culture determines to a significant degree whether the individual and the culture reach the good life or not. So that there's inherent compromises that the erotic impulse must make in order to survive within the context of a well-ordered society. And there's taboos, there's laws, there's scriptural admonitions, there's all kinds of ways that the culture regulates these primordial impulses in our psyche that have evolved over billions of years. So we're not the first generation to grapple with these impulses. We're only the cutting edge of a memory that goes back to the depths of time, where these contradictions have been worked out in one way or another. So I'd like to open this up now to I would say, the shadow content of Eros and this contradiction between You touched on that, Dan, and you certainly did, Topeka. But let's start with you, Topeka. Given your background and experience, you've got women and girls being incarcerated. They're coming up against the social order. How do you, in your own mind and in your own work, negotiate this dialectic between Eros and society?
I think, you know, what lands us into incarceration is that fight between the two.
Mhm.
And it leans me again on the great words of Nicole Daedone. Um, Instead of going the freedom from, it's the freedom to. And so what I've learned and what she articulates so beautifully, and I'm sure she will, but instead of fighting against it, you're moving toward it and understanding that in the world that we live and how we're trying to get free and whatever that looks like, because it looks different for everyone, right? And systems, when your systems impacted, and so whether that's incarceration, whether that's sexual trauma, violence, whether that's intimate partner violence, early childhood trauma, any of those, you are trying to be free from what society has shared with you, which is something that is not of our bodies or our own autonomy. And once we learn that we want to get to that freedom or to that top, then it's how do we get there? And so, what I'm teaching sisters through my work is that you don't grapple with it, you have to flow with it. That we often are moving away based on what other people tell us, right? You know, we only know what we know until we're taught something different. And many people who have experienced these systems only know what we know. And so for me, it's just really am, how am I impacting a person to let them know that that power is within them? Because we look outside for everything. And I think that's where Eros is. If it is in us and it is of us, then it is inside of us. And irrespective of what society says, irrespective of what, you know, who you may even think your teacher is telling you, that you feel it innately. What is the right thing for your life? Because it looks different for everyone. And in order to get to whatever that top is for you, you have to flow with it. So it's just sharing these, I guess, new teachings and new understandings in a way that allows women to just honor themselves and to honor their bodies and to understand that they can be, do, and have anything that they want from inside.
Yeah, yeah. Well, following on from that, Nicole, how do you understand this dialectic or contradiction that Freud pointed out, among many, many others? I just was referencing him since he gave kind of a classic expression of this, because the erotic impulse always has to have the container, and the container sometimes inhibits its free expression. And you spent a lot of time on this. What would be your general comment on this complexio?
I think we have this idea that Eros is it is a contradiction in some way to an ordered society or culture. And to my mind, it is the most ordered force that exists. Our challenges come that we operate in Buddhism. It would be called the Dharma. We operate in opposition to the Dharma, and then suffering is the natural occurrence. We're operating against the force of Eros, and as a result, we have a form of suffering as well. And so, you know, we used to think that we had to have dominion over nature. We had to control nature. And then we're starting, you know, now we're starting to have this idea about rewilding, and that it has its own sentience, its own intelligence, and that if we can have some humility and we can tune into it, it can actually be our greatest ally. In terms of, you know, I believe that the erotic impulse is the impulse toward whatever you wish to call it, God, spirit, the divine, sacred. And then it's the only force strong enough to bring us through our own most, as Jung says, cherished notions that we have such a hard time letting go of it at the instinctual level, but to fundamentally bring us to wholeness. And so you used Freud, and one of my favorite quotes is from Maslow, where he said, I think Freud studied pathology enough. It's time to study the potential. And that is the shift I think we're making culturally, and that's the shift I think we make as we move into the erotic impulse. There's two times in life when we have what's called hyperfocus. Hyperfocus is the holy grail of attention. It's where there's no thought, you feel connected to everything, you feel connected to the eternal, and that is when we're in life or death situations, or when sexual energies are activated. The only thing we've ever known, though, is to have those activations, but not have them connected to the attention. And so we assume that all of the dangers that happen as a result of these forces is implicit inside of the forces. No, it's because we turn off the attention when they come. If we can connect the attention to these forces, we can have the most powerful attention. Then you can connect that with intention, and that's where you really begin to see change, both in a person and in a culture.
Yeah, I want to dwell on this because I think you're making an extremely important point here. Freud said that the purpose of civilization was to repress
To
nature.
regulate.
And therefore, you repress the erotic.
That's right.
And what you're calling for, which I think is the seminal point of our time, since we're about ready to destroy ourselves because we're destroying nature with such profligate abandon, is that it's time to turn Freud on his head.
That's right.
And create a civilization that is in alignment with nature,
Yes.
natural law, in effect, and that would liberate the eros,
Exactly.
liberate the erotic impulses and tame the aggressive impulses.
Exactly. There's only one force that's strong enough, to subdue aggression, greed, hatred, and delusion. And that is the sexual energies. They're the only energies that are strong enough to pull those energies down in their rightful place to be used correctly. The same way you can have a scalpel or a weapon, right? It can operate in two different ways. Aggression is very important if it's meeked, because it can steer you toward clarity, toward cutting through delusion. It's very important, but it has to be meeked to something that's stronger than it. And that is really, sexual energies or eros. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the problems with the Freudian metaphor is that Freud did most of his work after World War I, and he was living in an extremely violent, ugly world.
Yes.
Of murder, mass murder. And he actually believed in sex and aggression were all for the survival of the individual, all for me, me, me. It's all greed. And love was an aim-inhibited transformation of greedy sexuality into caring about another person. There's no inherent basic impulse to connect, to love. There's a transformation of a greedy, self-interested impulse into love. But we now know that that's nonsense, because all mammals care for their young. And a lot of mammals cooperate with one another, and they can't have this great insight, an ego and repression. That's obviously not operating in their more primitive brains. In fact, we know from mystical experience that when you strip away all the acculturation, all you have is love. That's what the Beatles said. And they were the first to introduce that to Western culture, because the experiments with LSD blew them away. And they realized that that's the primordial connection. Now we also need greed and self-interest and aggression to protect ourselves. Otherwise, we would be helpless in the face of predators or individuals who want to take advantage of us. So there's a conflict there, but it's not a conflict between the basic selfishness and society. It's a conflict between our inherent love, eros, and love of others and connection, and our need to protect ourselves and be careful and take and promote ourselves.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And let me ask you, Dan, because I'm just so fascinated by the work that you've done with people that are under severe duress at all kinds of psycho-emotional levels. In your experience as a clinical psychologist, how does this dialectic between the individual and society, between freedom and stability, how does it play out with the kinds of people that you've treated for so long?
Well, one of the things that you experience when you work in prison systems and with people, especially people who've done horrible things to other people, is the only thing that is equal to the horrible things they've done is the horrible things that were done to them when they were growing up. They're often severely traumatized and disconnected from other people by agony and pain and abuse. And one of the ways in which some people want to work with them to help them reintegrate into society is to shame them. You have to realize what you did was so awful. And that's true. They do have to realize that what they did was so awful, but that just compounds the abuse. That just builds on it. That just intensifies the sense that they're not fully human and they're not going to be able to find love in the world, as opposed to inviting them in, trying to open up their natural connection to other people, become alive and to care about other people and themselves and to become part of the human community. And I've seen that happen in cases that would be absolutely shocking. People who've done some extraordinarily horrible things and who are now fully fledged human beings, just being with other people, connecting and living full lives. I had a room, I have an office in my house where I did group therapy with sex offenders who were all adjudicated sexually dangerous. They were in prison for one day to life and they got out. And one day they were standing around in my waiting room as they're leaving, they're just talking. And my 8-year-old son walks in the back door and walks through this cadre of sexually dangerous offenders into the house. And I said, oh, that's interesting. But I had no concern that he was in any danger. These weren't sex offenders, they were people. They were people who had moved away. Everybody, once you get to my age anyway, I don't know, once you get to middle age, you can almost everybody can look back at things they did when they were 18, 19, and 20 and go, oh my God, did I do that? I would never do that. Oh my God. There are certain things that are just completely ego dystonic. When we were young, they were ego syntonic. But we change. They become, that person who existed no longer exists. And that's the same way I see the reintegration of the people that I've treated back into society. They change. The person that they were no longer exists, and the new person arises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And
Can I
that,
say something quick?
yeah, please.
So one of the places that Dan, Topeka, and I meet is through prison work. I have a program that turns prisons into monasteries, and all three of us have had extraordinary interest in this domain specifically. And another intersection is that all three of us, in the same way I believe in rewilding, I believe in rehumanizing. And that's what Dan was speaking to. And what I was hearing is that there's a way that we can, when you have a sort of static idea of reality, you can project on them. They are offenders, not that they're human beings. And if that happens, then we have an insoluble problem. There's no way to ever reintegrate people. There's only punishment in putting people away. And so if you have a perspective that lacks eros and it then necessarily lacks creativity. There's just a fixed problem of a human being rather than creative solutions that not only see we the best we imagine is rehabilitation. We don't imagine transformation. We
Mm,
don't,
mm.
because we don't understand that force, the green that pushes the flower open. We don't understand that that's possible for every human being. And that's because, we'll talk more about the science, but one of the things that we've discovered was discovered, and Dan mentioned psychedelics as well, is that there's a valence. The valence is good or bad. And one of the things that psychedelics does, one of the things that Eros does, is it has enough force through arousal to break through that valence. And then you can go back and rewrite your experience and how you interpret it. So you're no longer enslaved to a single way of thinking or living or a habit. You can begin to work it very differently. And I think that's that's one of the ways that Eros being in every part of our culture is vital in terms of just opening up, like as what Maslow said, the potential.
Yeah, yeah. And as he was drawing a lot from Wilhelm Reich's notion
Right.
of Eros being not only the primordial, but the essential
The essential.
aspect. And when that gets distorted in any way, that's when all kinds of bad things happen
That's right.
to the individual, to the culture, to the politics, to the social fabric, to the spiritual and religious traditions. And so it's really time, I think, in our culture to reevaluate all the norms that we've taken as givens, in some cases for thousands of years.
And we've taken them as givens against all evidence.
Yes,
With a lack of
yes,
efficacy, total distortion in the world. But we don't want to look at this one thing. This one thing we're still sure it's bad, but yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, this is the point I'd like to turn to orgasmic meditation and the lineage, because as we all know, there's in every culture, there's a thread that goes back to primordial times where people have sought to blend Eros into culture, into spirituality, into politics with varying levels of success and longevity. Many of the lineages have been secret. Many of the lineages have been persecuted, such that it's hard sometimes to track the thread very far back. But it's most explicitly articulated, I would say, in the Indian tradition with Tantra. And I just wanted to frame orgasmic meditation and ask Nicole for you to speak to it and to begin our discussion. And then we'll get Dan to some of the scientific evidence and so forth and so on. Where does orgasmic meditation, Nicole, fit in the tantric lineage that is sought to consciously support Eros in the culture?
Well, I don't know that it has sought to consciously support anymore. I mean, I think that's one of the
Okay.
challenges that we're facing is both women and sexual energies, which were the path to enlightenment, have been excluded by the monks for a good period of time. And as a result, there's been a big movement. The Dalai Lama, for example, in Tantric Buddhism, in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, has made a call to bring these practices back into play. So I think we lost access in a certain way, but all traditions, including Catholicism. Pope John Paul X wrote Theology of the Body, which is one of the most exquisite erotic books I've ever read. It's stunning. And then you have these traditions, and I think that there comes and yoga, and yoga started as a practice to increase sexual energy so that you move what's called the Kundalini energy up through the spine that wakes up the, you know, third eye, etc. The question is, you're right, it is extraordinarily controversial. And I think we have a fundamental fear of arousal because we have a culture based on control. And that's where the rub, the contradiction happens. But there's this expression, contradiction or paradox is God or the sacred standing on his head, looking for our attention. And so those are actually the points of great access. The most access is in those places, and understanding that it's a high intensity experience to work with these energies. But, my question was and has been, if you knew that you had something that had profound capacity to, bring people to a new level of realization or evolution, what would you do? That was the question of the early yogis in the United States, where they would say dark turbaned men are putting our women in danger. That was an actual headline. There's a great article called Fear of Yoga in the Etni Reader. Or when Tantric Buddhism from Tibet came in through Trungpa, he was shipped out of the United States because it was perceived as so dangerous. And so there's some way that the offering keeps coming. Hey, there's a way out. There's a way out of this suffering. And, my prayer is that we're at a time where people can begin to hear in the same way that we only used to think of psychedelics as, damaging. There was the war on sex, and psychedelics were akin to, opium or heroin, and now they're a panacea. And I think the next evolution is to understand even more profound, because you can steer it at a different level, our sexual energies. And that's what I saw when I saw, I was going to be a Zen nun. So when and then I was introduced to this practice. And when I was introduced to the practice, I was very clear. This is a radically accelerated path to states that had taken me years to touch into. And then if you look at our science, a 30-year Tibetan Buddhist practitioner has the same state that you find in an orgasmic meditation practitioner at 7 minutes. And not only that, there's a fusion between the two practitioners, two people who are doing the practice. And that is extraordinary when you think, wait a minute, it's training us to feel each other. There can be nothing, I don't think, more healing for the planet than for us to be able to feel each other. And that alone will bring us to a deeper level of ethics and morality, but it'll also bring us to a deeper level of meaning in our lives. The experience of limbic resonance is the experience of being seen, felt, and known underneath the language center. And that's what I think we're looking for. There's this constant chronic search. I think it's fundamentally just for intimacy. For human intimacy.
Yeah, at the heart of Om is intimacy.
That's right. That's what you
and
find.
At the heart of intimacy is connectivity.
That's right. That's right.
And that's what we all need to be who we are.
Yes. And reflection of our deeper nature. Not, I went on this retreat and they said, the reason we feel so awake in nature is that the reflection we're getting is the infinite. It's not a billboard telling us what to buy. So it's not, yeah.
Now, Nicole, what I find fascinating when I first learned about it was the emphasis on the female. Right. Because in many classic tantric practices, it's all about the male. And the female in some ways is a kind of serving the sublimation of the male seed and bringing up the spine and all the things that you see in the kind of yab yum pictures and so forth and so on. But you have developed something that really focuses on feminine, the female orgasm, and the person stimulating is brought in, but that feels to me to be a profound development.
I have a friend, Jim Harriet, and he says it's turning the world right side up. The way
Yeah.
things actually work is how the practice itself works. It's the physical analog for the way things work. You know, it really, if you just look at, Dan and I wrote a paper on call, biological call. You know, a gorilla or an elephant will travel 200 miles. If a female is in estrus, she issues a call and there's a response, and females have both call and response. And so there's human females have what's called volitional estrus. We can send out a signal and we can actually learn to drive and steer that signal to raise, you know, arousal, which eventually becomes awareness. And so it's putting things in the right order, and then putting, Audre Lorde said that Eros is power or spirituality on a feminine plane. So it's our territory, it's our home, it's our native territory. But it's in the same way you can't see your own eyeball, we don't know it. We haven't known it. And so it's actually being, you know, reoriented to our homeland, and then issuing the directives from there in such a way that at 7 minutes in the practice, there's this synchronization of nervous systems. So that's what we, you know, when the focus is on us and when we're clear about what the desire is and how to communicate about it, and then producing that result, then there's that experience of both people being in flow, a flow state or a mystical state together.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to you, Dan. Let's jump into the evidence. I think this is a good point to have you speak, and then we'll hear from Andrew. As you've kind of studied the Om phenomenon, shall we say, share with us the results of your studies.
Okay, so first of all, the study is designed for me, is designed in an evolutionary biological understanding of the human psyche, which was designed by millions of years of natural selection and evolution to be able to manage traumatic experiences and survive and thrive. Life is traumatic. People die. Loved ones disappear. Relationships are shattered. There are famines, natural disasters, and human-caused tragedies such as wars, racism, and all sorts of violent struggles between groups. Evolving in a world in which there were no rubber-cushioned playgrounds for children, no drugs to diminish anxiety, the normal psyche is plagued with negative thoughts. In fact, it was designed to be plagued with those worries that ensure that the individuals act to avoid tragedy. So in addition to whatever good thoughts and experiences we may have, we are unavoidably plagued with terrible, bad thoughts, worries, fears, hurts, and anxieties. Did I hurt so-and-so? Does so-and-so love me? Why must my loved one suffer so? Is this sickness potentially dangerous? Why am I so sick? I can't take it. Is this sickness? When, where, how, why will I die? How long can we ignore the destruction of the life-sustaining biosphere? And many other concerns, including the central concern of my most recent book, why is it that groups of people are so murderous to one another? That's my book. Oh, you can't see it because, not sharing screen. Okay. We must keep in mind that in the ancient world in which we evolved, half the children died before reaching adulthood. Having a tooth abscess was a frequent cause of death. The terribly painful ruminations were unavoidable for biological evolved sentient beings who were selected, shaped for life in a world of conflict with enormous suffering, inevitable losses, and certain death. Unlike the lower animals, once we leave childhood, we know that we will face horrific pain. At varying points in most human lives, the resulting existential angst is simply excruciating. Yet the human psyche was designed to enable our species to survive and thrive. The formation of post-traumatic stress disorder is a sign that the normal adaptive human response to trauma has broken down. My understanding is that this breakdown can be caused by one of two things, sometimes both at the same time. The first is that the specific trauma is so over the top and devastating that it's just too much to process. It simply overwhelms the psyche. In such cases, time can sometimes heal the wound. However, when the trauma also destroys a major part of the individual's identity, the damage can be long-lasting. For example, one may believe that one lives in a world in which good inevitably triumphs over evil, that ultimately a benevolent deity will prevent the arbitrary annihilation of one's family and friends. What happens to such a belief when then the one experiences an entire group of family and friends vanish in a murderous hail of bombs and bullets? The trauma in such a case is not just the fear of annihilation of the self and the danger to one's body. Despite surviving, such an individual may experience the actual annihilation of a major feature of the individual's world, the loss of the underlying belief system that had been vital in making the traumatic world bearable. The other aspect of trauma that often leads to post-traumatic stress disorder is isolation. When the individual experiences overwhelming anxiety and terror and has no one to process it with, no safe community to return to, no place where the trauma can be held in the collective psyche in which the individual is not alone and lost. For such an individual, there is no safe place for healing to occur. In our society, the response to traumatic stress that can't be normally processed, the response to PTSD has been to turn it off, to try to turn off the experiencing psyche, to shut it down, to numb it out with psychotropic drugs or antidepressants. Other techniques may be more natural and less crude than drugs. For example, meditation techniques have been employed to refocus the mind on neutral, calming, or pleasant thoughts. While this doesn't produce the negative side effects of medications, it is still an attempt to turn away from high arousal as if quiescence is the solution to undue anxiety. Om suggests a new approach to life's agonizing traumas. Om, as I understand it, is composed of two basic components. One is the recognized helpful provision of a relationship in which one can feel safe while deeply connected to another. The other component is the arousing sexual stimulation that intensifies that connection. This is more controversial. Is it safe to encourage individuals with PTSD to become sexually aroused? I was presented with anecdotal evidence from practitioners of Om that frequently suggested that Om can enable one to overcome trauma symptoms. Rather than shutting the psyche down, in a safe space, Om intensifies the feeling of aliveness in the context of a deep connection to another person. Since isolation is a major feature of PTSD, intensifying the sense of a profound, safe, powerfully pleasurable connection to another person could challenge the entire conglomeration of internal experiences that actually comprise PTSD. So now I continue on to determine if this anecdotal evidence is more generally applicable to this population. Rachel Pelletier, Carolyn Griggs, Karen Roth, and I designed a study to determine whether Om could be safely employed by folks with PTSD. We recruited a dozen couples in which at least one person had the symptoms we call PTSD. Next, using the Om app, the couples were instructed in orgasmic meditation, and they engaged in Om at least 3 times each week for 1 month. 2 weeks later, a follow-up assessment was performed. The results were pretty clear. The y-axis on this graph is the PCL score. PCL is a test to measure the symptoms of PTSD. The horizontal axis, the x-axis, is time. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and then the break, and then 2 weeks later, week 6. Notice that the PTSD scores are going down. This is the average of the PTSD scores over the time period of the study, and you can see how they're going down rather dramatically. These scores are the scores at the left, at the top left, indicate PTSD. The scores later on in the study are actually below the cutoff point for PTSD. Unfortunately, there was no control group in this exploratory study that participated but did not engage in Om. So it is impossible to be sure that the improvement was due specifically to Oming as opposed to the placebo effect. Further research is needed. However, the primary goal of this study was to determine if Om could be safely employed with those suffering from PTSD. The Om perception survey indicates that Om may not only be safe, but that the participants experience it as having a marked positive impact. Note the strong agreement. All these things are positive statements about Om. Note this extremely strong agreement. Between strong agreement and mild agreement, almost all the participants endorsed these positive statements, except for one. And that was, I feel orgasmic meditation decreases PTSD symptoms. Now, this is really interesting because even though when they asked that question directly, they said they didn't think it eliminated their PTSD symptoms, yet they overwhelmingly indicated that they felt more safe, more connected, have improved quality of life, felt less anxious and depressed, less isolated, more hopeful, and less reactive after practicing Om. And so at first, this is somewhat paradoxical, given that those are precisely diminished PTSD symptoms. What this may be indicating is that one can have improvement in symptoms without giving up a label that one has been using to define one's life. And that's a negative effect of defining the individual with PTSD as a victim. Once that definition has taken hold, it's hard to shake. They clearly were getting rid of the PTSD symptoms, but when you ask them, does the label still apply to you? Absolutely, it didn't change the label at all. A longer study would be needed to determine if the disorder can be eliminated by longer practice. In any case, the study strongly suggests that Om may be a powerful tool for dealing with PTSD. And more importantly, while the study was too small to indicate that there was no danger in employing Om with this disorder, the results were consistent enough to indicate that there is no reason to assume that Om would be dangerous and should be avoided when it comes to dealing with PTSD. Further research is definitely called for.
Amazing, amazing work. I'm going to suggest before Topeka and Nicole comment that we bring in Andrew's presentation, and then we'll have all the research together.
And she started to explain to me a little bit about what the orgasmic meditation practice was, how it worked. And I was very intrigued for two main reasons. One was that it seemed that it had this very clear and concise approach, which was actually very helpful and very positive in my view, because many times when I study a practice, it's much looser. You know, when we studied Buddhist meditators, I would have a conversation with them. Well, how long are you going to do this practice? When do we do a brain scan? And they would say, well, you know, I could be doing it for 45 minutes. I could do it for an hour. I could do it for 20 minutes. And that's hard for me as a researcher. But this practice is very short. It's 15 minutes. It's it's all very well designed. And to me, as in terms of doing a research study, it seemed like it was something that really had an opportunity to be able to be more easily studied than a lot of the other practices that I had looked at. But the other piece that was going on in the back of my mind was this prior discussion that we had with, gee, this is a little bit of, could this be this little missing link that I have been looking for many, many years, that looks to find a way of bringing together something that has a sexual element to it with something that has a spiritual element. And I was very intrigued by the idea that when people were doing orgasmic meditation, that the goal was not a sexual experience, even though there's the use of that sexual energy, but that it's really about a meditative practice, a meditative experience, a spiritual feeling that people get. And I could tell even in the description, where she was going with this whole thing in terms of that kind of spiritual, mystical elements to it that sounded so much like many of the spiritual experiences that I had been studying over the years. So I immediately was very intrigued by that. I actually explained to her my background in looking at these kinds of questions and looking at this relationship. So I don't think she even knew that at the time. So she was, she thought I just did studies of this because I was just studying meditation and religious experiences, didn't realize that there was this whole other piece to it that really went back 30 years. So that is what kind of led us to ultimately being able to design a study and being able to execute it and get some fascinating results that led us to being able to put the book project together by looking at that data and seeing how that sexuality and spirituality are so interwoven within our biology. So part of what we saw in the context of our study in orgasmic meditation, which may be the quickest answer to your question, is that while we see certain areas of the brain that seem to be affected, that we also have seen in other types of meditative practices, like changes in the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe that are associated with that sense of oneness and a sense of sort of surrendering and connecting and so forth. There were also some changes that occurred in some very core areas of the brain, which have been looked at as being involved in sexual arousal and sexual experience. Now, interestingly, they are different. It does not look like just sexual arousal either. That is a very different kind of look than what we saw in the orgasmic meditation study. So, to me, orgasmic meditation really does represent a kind of true hybrid. It's kind of utilizing that sexual energy, so to speak, which kind of then drives these higher areas. But then the experiences that you can have ultimately do have a lot in common with the spirituality, and that hence the argument of it's kind of the same basic platform that you're working on. But you also raised to me what's one of my favorite topic, so to speak, in this whole field that's called neurotheology, which is, I really think about it as this big jigsaw puzzle. And so there are many different avenues that you can get to, that you can kind of go down to get to different spiritual experiences. And they, you mentioned a whole bunch of them: psychedelics and near-death experiences and meditation and orgasmic meditation and so forth. So there are many different pathways to these kinds of experiences. And what I have actually tried to elaborate in our research is this very complex network of structures that, depending on what you do, you kind of connect in different ways. And so, if you're doing a meditation practice, a sort of a pure concentration meditation practice where you're just concentrating on something, concentrating on an image, well, that's a little bit more of a top-down kind of process. You're just kind of using your frontal lobes, you're concentrating on the object, and then you start to generate all these changes. I think that what's interesting about sexual experience, using sexual energy as part of that process, is it kind of drives the process a little bit more from the bottom up, so to speak, because it's coming from your autonomic nervous system. It's affecting some of these very core areas of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the thalamus and the brainstem, which really regulates sexuality. But then as they then kind of connect up into the brain, you can kind of lead to these same kinds of processes. And in fact, that's part of how rituals themselves work. I mean, the whole actual process of the mating ritual is that it starts by, creating that connection, creating that identification. But as it proceeds, the rhythmicity is what ultimately leads to sexual peaks, sexual climax or orgasm. And so that the whole process can unfold. And then that's part of what also drives that whole experience. So I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap between all of them, but there also can be, unique elements. And I think part of what can be helpful is, there are ways of facilitating these experiences. So one could make the argument, would you rather, spend 30 years in a Zen monastery meditating on, a Zen koan about one hand clapping until you find enlightenment? Or would you rather, try to jumpstart the process, if you will, by using some other avenue that might be faster? And I think, something like sexual energy might be able to do that. Certainly the Kundalini approaches and the Tantric yogas and so forth utilize that approach with an orgasmic meditation similarly to try to do that in a way that facilitates that experience.
Brilliant stuff. Enlightenment from the bottom up rather
Right.
than the top down. And I thought I would just comment on that last point because it's so seminal. Virtually all our religious traditions, certainly the Abrahamic, even the Hindu, Buddhist, it's this impulse toward transcendence. And what is coming forth out of the tantric traditions generally, and certainly orgasmic meditation, is from the bottom up. And that's really upending the culture in a very fundamental way. And so thank you, Dan, for that research, that, if Om can modify and lower the trauma associated with PTSD, it can handle probably any domain of human suffering with a positive, salutary effect. So that's really important, everyone, for us to take in as we work through all the controversies to try to discern the truth about what's actually going on. And so I'd like to start with you, Topeka, and then Nicole, with any comments you want to make on what Dan and Andrew have just laid out.
Well, I mean, to be frank, no. I mean, I think they laid it out beautifully. I think it speaks to why, orgasmic meditation is of our time and why people, need to open up to practicing, or at least allowing others to practice. I think it is the science doesn't lie, right? If it is healing people without the use of, other substances that we know are sometimes harmful, then let's do it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think that the all the evidence shows and proves it. So, I would like, and Nicole and I've talked about, I would like to see people in prison being able to practice. That's a hope one day. And maybe one day soon, you never know. But I think that everyone should have an opportunity to learn this way of healing, to transcend and to be at your deepest self. So thank you, Dan, for the research.
Yeah, very much so. Nicole, what would you add or extend or underscore about the research, since it's always obviously been about what you're doing?
Right. So I started the practice, I think it was 25 years ago, something of that nature. And in my first Om, I hit the mystical state. That's what samadhi, what you're looking for in Zen, is what I hit. And that's what had me practice for 7 years the way I would in a monastery, the practice. And it was so clear to me that the implications were profound, that so much of what we knew to be a given wasn't a given anymore. And so, not long after, I started talking to anybody who would talk to me who was in the field of science, and I was laughed out of virtually every single office I went into. And, they just wanted to know about climax, really, and how to improve, especially men's climax. And I would say, no, that's like a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 about what I'm talking about. There's something profound. And then the book Flow came out, And then I really began to understand the mystical state as was being described through psychedelics. And I realized, oh, we're talking about the same thing. And then from there, though, with Om, you could steer it and you could have reliable, repeatable results on a long-term basis with accelerating experiences and nuanced and subtle. So then, finally, Dr. Nicole Prause and Greg Siegel and Dan and Dr. Andrew were willing to, really, come on. I walk into an office, I say, there's this practice, it has to do with clitoral stroking. I'm sure it's going to really change everything we know about trauma, everything we know about self-realization. And they said, I could see where that could happen. And so then it took, we did the largest paired partner study since Masters and Johnson. So that was in the 1950s. We did over 200 people, and there'll never be anything like that again because of COVID. The protocols are so severe now. So, well, there may be, but, and in that, Nikki and Greg were so blown away by the results that, but I wasn't, because I everything that we've discovered, I've experienced. It's self-evident to me. When I met Dan, one of the things that Dan understood, or one of the things that we agreed on, is that our perspective on trauma is just woefully misinformed, that you have the greatest potential for transformation with the congested material of trauma if you have enough heat and power to transform it. And I said, we started having that conversation, and that's when I knew, okay, we can do this study. But the studies we did with Nicole and Greg, one of the things that they found is you have decreased negative affect, which antidepressants give you, but they also give you decreased positive affect. So you just feel less. In Om, you have decreased negative affect and increased positive affect. So you have just this greater potential for happiness with fewer negative feelings and experiences. Another thing that they found is that you can actually go into the material that you can't otherwise go into that we consider trauma material. But in Buddhism, you just call it suffering. In Eros, you call it tumescence. But it's this, congested material that dysregulates the nervous system, and then that really dysregulates cognition. And you can actually go into it. You can bring this, and Dan describes it as a piece of dynamite that blows it open. And then all of a sudden, what was blocked and congested is now working for you. It's working in terms of greater flow in the consciousness. So, I mean, for me, it has been affirming. And by the same token, that it is so incredibly controversial is insanity to me. That it was so difficult for each of these researchers, and some of the things that they've gone through in terms of carrying the research, that it's so taboo when every single result is consistently saying this is on the considered one of the top protocols for trauma at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to point out, the story of Om is also the story of the research on the psychedelics.
That's right.
And various other therapies that have burst into the culture
Right.
over the last 50, 75 years. First there's this curiosity, then there's this repression, and then slowly but surely the positive effects become overwhelmingly compelling.
Well, it's Schopenhauer, right? First you're ridiculed, then you're viciously attacked, and then
Exactly.
it's introduced into the culture as normal. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And just to turn to you, Topeka, since you're working well, for all three of you, since you're working in prisons, how close are we to being able to take something like Om into the prisons or into the the people that you're dealing with, Dan, that, you know, severely traumatized and therefore under kind of lockdown in some way or another. Is that in the offing, or is that a long way away? Topeka, what would you say?
I wouldn't say it's a long way away. Anything that I'm involved in.
Topeka, you're breaking up.
We can't hear you. Something with your speaker.
My speaker?
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. There we go.
That's better. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I said anything that I'm involved in doesn't take long. But as we know with prisons, it's always a little bit of time. I will say that I've been able to have some preliminary conversations with people who work in different systems about it, who are open. And so that's a start. The other thing is, you know, thinking about justice impacted women and girls in community, whether, you know, someone who's previously incarcerated, we are opening up the space and inviting women into the space that way. And so that's huge because it's also another healing modality, as you know, the research shows. And so that is actually happening now. However, getting it in prisons, I say give us a year. We can get it done. I think we get it done in a year. And anytime I speak anything with the Women's Empower group, we get it done anyway. So I'm putting it out there. That means that's the next of 100 million other things I'm putting out there. But we'll get it done in at least one prison within a year.
Yeah.
When I first heard about the prison monastery project, I imagined, are they bringing Om into prison? Can they actually do that? And so far, it hasn't happened, but maybe it will. But the model would be when Timothy Leary went into the Concord prison and did psilocybin with the inmates. They had groups, and they had tremendous results. The recidivism among the people that he did the psilocybin with dropped to almost zero. Of course, then all that was shut down when Richard Nixon declared that he was the most dangerous person in America. And but maybe it's possible. It would be very interesting to do a small research. It had to be probably done as a research project. We're going to do this to see if it works and in a very controlled way. But I would imagine that some prison somewhere might be willing to open it up and give it a shot.
And this is actually what I had met Rodessa, who works in our program, and Topeka and Dan. So we have the vision of a complementary program in terms of, for women, there's a healing that occurs, and one of the things that Nikki and Greg found is that people who have sexual trauma, and most women, to be honest, and who are incarcerated do, who have sexual trauma, one of the signs of having trauma is that their arousal capacity goes down. Whereas what they found in the study was it goes up with Om because it's such a safe container. So these women are, healing within the container itself. But what I had talked to Dan about is that it also, because the person, who's stroking is learning a profound sense of impulse control, because you only get the positive reinforcement, you only get the mystical state when you can control your attention as connected to sexual energies. So the implications for perpetrators is profound, because the impulse control is the challenge. I heard one person describe it like, I don't want to harm anybody, but it's like I'm at the top of a mountain going down in a car and I don't have any brakes. And what Om trains practitioners in is those brakes, not repression, but how to have brakes in a way that you can have sustainable impulse control.
So it's like it instills self-modulation.
That's right. Exactly.
Instead of repression, it's control that allows for expression and for increased intensity.
Yeah. Well, it's so extraordinary, the experience you've been through, Nicole, as you brought this out into the world. I mean, few areas in society are more impacted with taboo and than sexuality and erotica. And you've come in with orgasmic meditation in a very new and revolutionary kind of way with women and creating it in a safe space and a contained way. And there's been research. And yet the controversy that has surrounded you is without end,
It is.
including, acrimony, accusations, legalities, and so forth and so on. And I'd just like to hear from you about what it's been like navigating through this thicket. Because you like many pioneers, you've paid a high price.
Right. It is a high price, and um, it's the whole process is so it's almost it's poetic in a strange way, in that it's the practice itself is what gave me the resilience and fortitude to carry the practice through the fire and through the difficulties. I'm still very, strong and resilient through incredible, nearly insurmountable difficulties, and that's a result of the practice, because precisely what it trains is how to have total control over your attention, irrespective of what's happening. So in that way, it's a blessing that I come from and have what I have, and that I have Sangha, I have the friends that I have, the family that I have, the resources that I have. And somebody once, a tantric practitioner once said, Nicole, I wish you much disillusionment. And I was, this is early in my practice, and when you think about it, that's what you want, right? You want to lose the illusions that things operate in a certain way. I have had my share of disillusionment. It's been in many ways heartbreaking, but ultimately it's going to be the heartbreaking open. I'm fortunate that there was never a question. There's never a question for me, through all the difficulties, if it was worth it or not, because it's like, I feel like this practice and this philosophy actually gave me the life that I have. So there's no question as to whether or not I would carry it to the end.
Yeah, and that's the mark of the hero's journey, the heroine's journey. That one who embarks, and as St. John of the Cross says, I went out without discerning and with nothing to guide me except that which in my heart was burning.
Oh, I have not heard that. That is very good.
And that's you. And Topeka, that's you. Dan, that's you. These, you've been pioneering with, what the Greeks called pothos, deep yearning, the yearning of the soul, the unrequited yearning of the soul that just takes you out into it. And then you get all those disillusionments, and yet you can't give up. You won't give up because you can't give up.
That's right.
And that is what brings novelty into the world. And that's what allows Eros to stay and play with love and beauty. And so as we bring this to a close, I want to really thank you. And I'd like to start with you, Dan, and then Topeka, and then Nicole, just whatever final statements you would like to make, having had this discussion about Eros and the contradictions of Eros and civilization and the shadow content and the own tantric breakthrough, I would say, of our time, if you had to distill down what's actually happening here. So Dan, what would you say in closing?
I believe that the reality that the underlying reality is something that we really only experience in a mystical state. And that lets loose. When you strip away all the acculturation, who am I, our language, the proper customs and manners, when you strip everything away and you're just left as a biological living animal organism that's alive, you experience the beauty of being. I call that toddler wonder. Everybody's in love with toddlers. When you see a toddler and they're so alive and the world is all fresh and new, then we lose that as we get acculturated and we learn to be serious about life and get down and buckle down and do the work. And that's all important. We need to do that because someone's got to protect the toddlers, right? So they can have toddler wonder. But when psychedelics or Om or intense sexual experience strips away all that acculturation and you're left with that experience of being, that's it. That's the point of existence. That's the meaning of life. And we need to, as a society, as a culture, as a world, we need to get more in touch with that before we do irrevocable damage.
Yeah. It's really a race against the clock to have that peak experience, not only as individuals, but as a culture, to remind us of who we really are and why we're really here. I mean, absolutely. Very, very, very profound, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. Topeka.
Yeah, I'd like to do an exercise with everyone. If everyone can just repeat after me and my final thoughts. And that's everybody if they could take off a mute too, because I'd like to hear the 100 people's voices and more that are on here right now. So if you repeat after me, I breathe life into my body.
I breathe
life
into my body.
into my body.
I honor the sacred fire within me.
I
honor the sacred fire within
me.
My pleasure is my prayer.
My pleasure is my prayer.
Body is a temple of the divine feminine.
My body is a temple of the divine feminine.
I rise rooted in love.
I rise
rooted in love.
I am Eros. I am enough. I am free.
I am
Eros,
I am enough. I am free.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I am Eros. I am enough. I am free. Nicole, what say you?
I have so much. Thank you is where I want to start. But so you said something about both of you, you and Dan said something about time being of the essence, and the Buddha said people, somebody asked the Buddha, what is the biggest mistake people make, and he said people think they have time. We think we have time. We keep putting off, and one of the beauties of the mystical state, as Dan mentioned, is that it accelerates your potential. The science says what would take an hour, what would take 40 hours only takes an hour when you're in the mystical state. So it accelerates our potential that much. I think that that's why these protocols, psychedelics, why they're being integrated while they're integrating themselves, is how I'll put it, psychedelics, is so that we can meet the call of the times, and that we've been given that. So that's, so Jung talks about the numinous being making the impossible possible. And that's the edge that I live on, where what I hold is that we can really make the impossible possible at this time. And then I want to say to you, Jim, this is just a personal thing. Dan and Topeka have been, there's like a world down here of people, and you don't know you don't somebody once described it as a subway. You don't know who's going to be on, but it's people who have had a flash, who have seen something that you've seen that you couldn't communicate to anybody. It's like there's a shorthand in the language, and I kept hearing my song when you would speak. I kept hearing the language, and so it's been a profound experience to be with the three of you, all of whom I've heard the same song with. So thank you.
Thank you. This has been a rich discussion, everyone. I've enjoyed every minute of it. We should do it again and deepen the dialogue at some point. And so I want to deeply thank all of you for participating today. And what's coming to my mind as we close is that great little poem of Rainer Maria Rilke that you probably all know, that time and again in history, some special people wake up. They have no place in the crowd. They carry strange customs with them and demand room for bold and audacious actions. The future speaks ruthlessly through them. They change the world. Time and again in history, some special people wake up. They have no place in the crowd. They carry strange customs with them and demand room for bold and audacious action. And the future speaks ruthlessly through them. Ruthlessly through them. And we change the world. Thank you, Nicole, for everything you do. Thank you, Topeka, for everything you do. And Dan, thank you for everything you do. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Tim.